Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the situation in Yemen and the surrounding region.
Yeah.
We've got some really interesting news reports from Thai sources that shed light on some recent events. And you might have heard little bits and pieces about this conflict here and there, but we're going to really give you a clearer picture of what's happening, who are the key players, and why this matters.
It's a fascinating situation, and what really jumps out at me is the escalation that we've seen, particularly with the involvement of the U.S. military. It's not simply about containing the Houthis anymore. It seems like the strategy is really shifting towards actively trying to degrade their military capabilities.
Okay, so let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through the chain of events that kind of led up to this point?
Well, it all began with a series of Houthi attacks. And these weren't just, random acts of violence. These were targeted strikes aimed at Tel Aviv in Israel.
Wow.
And they actually resulted in some reported injuries.
Okay, now for those who might not be totally up to speed, can you give us just a quick rundown of who the Houthis are?
Sure. So the Houthis are a Zaidi Shia rebel group, and they've been fighting the Yemeni government for control of the country for years now. They've gained a lot of ground, and they're a really significant force in the region.
So Tel Aviv being attacked, that's a big deal, right? I mean, that's not just a regional conflict anymore.
Exactly. That's why the U.S. response was so swift and forceful. They launched retaliatory strikes against a whole range of Houthi targets in Yemen. This included missile storage facilities, command centers, drone sites, even locations for anti-ship missiles.
Wow, that sounds like they were really trying to send a very clear message. So what do you think the thinking was behind hitting those particular targets?
Well, if you look at the types of targets that were hit, it seems like the U.S. is really focused on crippling the Houthis' ability to project power both on land and at sea.
Yep.
So taking out their missile storage and command centers directly impacts their ability to coordinate attacks. And then targeting their drones and anti-ship missiles is a direct response to the threat they pose to international shipping in the Red Sea.
Ah, the Red Sea. Now, that's another thing that I think some listeners might not fully grasp the significance of. Can you talk about why that's so important in this whole situation?
Think of the Red Sea as a major highway for global trade. I mean, a huge amount of cargo oil and other essential goods are passing through those waters every single day.
Yeah.
If the Houthis can disrupt that flow of traffic, it has a ripple effect on economies around the world. It's basically like creating a global traffic jam with huge economic consequences.
Okay, that makes sense. So the U.S. is trying to protect those shipping lanes by targeting the Houthis' ability to disrupt them. But this is not just about the U.S. and the Houthis, right?
No, absolutely not. There are other players involved, and their actions make this situation even more complex.
Can you give us some examples?
Well, Israel isn't just sitting back and taking these attacks from the Houthis. They've launched their own retaliatory strikes on Houthi-controlled infrastructure, hitting ports and energy facilities.
It seems like everyone is getting dragged into this conflict.
And then there's the incident with the U.S. fighter jet being shot down over the Red Sea.
Oh, right. That was a huge story.
Right.
Wasn't that a Houthi attack?
No, this is where things get really interesting. It wasn't the Houthis who shot down that jet. It was actually friendly fire. The FA-18 Hornet was accidentally hit by a missile from the USS Gettysburg, a U.S. Navy cruiser.
Whoa, wait. So the U.S. military accidentally shot down one of their own planes. How could that even happen?
It's a stark reminder that even with all the advanced technology and training that the U.S. military has, accidents can still happen, especially in a high-pressure combat situation. We don't have all the details yet, but it appears there was some kind of misidentification of the aircraft. The USS Gettysburg, for whatever reason, perceived the FA-18 as a hostile target.
That's terrifying to think about.
Yeah.
And what happened to the pilots?
Well, luckily they were rescued, though one of them did sustain some injuries.
That's good to hear. But this whole incident just raises so many questions. What does it say about the U.S. involvement in this conflict, and what could be the fallout from such a high-profile mistake?
I think it's significant for a few reasons. Firstly, it shows that even the most sophisticated military in the world is not immune to errors. These things can happen, and the consequences can be deadly.
Absolutely.
Secondly, it could have a real impact on public perception, both in the U.S. and internationally. An accident like this can erode trust and raise doubts about the overall strategy of the U.S. intervention.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if this will cause the U.S. to kind of rethink their approach. So aside from this incident, the U.S. isn't the only one carrying out strikes against the Houthis, right?
That's right. Both the U.S. and the U.K. have been conducting strikes on Houthi targets throughout the year. The official justification is that these strikes are necessary to protect international shipping in the Red Sea and ensure the safe passage of goods.
So we've got the U.S., the U.K., and Israel all carrying out military actions against the Houthis, each with their own motivations and objectives. It seems like this conflict is spreading like wildfire. So what does this mean for the stability of the region as a whole?
That's a really important question. This conflict has the potential to destabilize the entire region and draw in even more international actors. It's a very delicate situation, and the risks of unintended consequences are incredibly high.
Okay, so we've talked about the U.S. and their allies. But let's talk about the Houthis themselves. What exactly are their capabilities? They seem to be more than just a ragtag group of rebels.
You're right, the Houthis are a force to be reckoned with. The fact that they were able to launch such a sophisticated attack on Tel Aviv, a city with very strong air defenses, speaks volumes about their evolving military capabilities.
So it seems like they've really stepped up their game in terms of military power. What does this mean for their position in the conflict and their ability to influence the outcome?
Well, their increasing military capabilities definitely give them more leverage and make them a much more formidable opponent. They're no longer just a nuisance. They pose a serious threat to regional stability. And they're not afraid to take credit for their actions either.
Right.
They've even claimed responsibility for attacks in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, though they blame those attacks on Western forces.
Blaming Western forces. Classic tactic to try and shift the narrative, right?
Exactly. It allows them to play the victim card while simultaneously demonstrating their reach and power. They're basically saying, look, we can strike anywhere, even within our own territory, and we're not afraid to do so.
Sounds like a dangerous game they're playing. So they're claiming responsibility for attacks in Sana'a, their own capital. Why would they do that? That seems counterproductive.
It does seem a bit strange, right? But there could be a few things going on here. Maybe they're trying to sow discord and instability within the government-controlled areas, or perhaps they're trying to exploit existing tensions and grievances among the population. It's also possible that there are internal power struggles within the Houthi movement itself, and these attacks could be a way of consolidating power or silencing dissent.
Oh, so much going on behind the scenes. It seems like the more we dig into this conflict, the more layers we uncover. It's like peeling back an onion. Every layer reveals another level of complexity.
It's true, and that complexity is what makes this situation so challenging to understand and even more challenging to resolve. There's no easy solution here, and the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah, definitely no easy answers here.
Yeah.
But before we get too bogged down, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about something that could potentially be a glimmer of hope in this otherwise very bleak situation. There are reports that suggest there might be a ceasefire in the works between Israel and Hamas.
Yes, that is a very interesting development. If that ceasefire does materialize, it could have significant ripple effects throughout the region.
Okay, so let's talk about those ripple effects. What are the potential impacts of an Israel-Hamas ceasefire on the situation in Yemen?
Well, it's tough to say for sure, but there are a couple of possible scenarios. On the one hand, a ceasefire could lead to a decrease in tensions in the region overall. If a major regional power like Israel is taking steps towards de-escalation, it could create a more favorable environment for dialogue and diplomacy in other conflicts, including Yemen. But on the other hand, it's also possible that a ceasefire could embolden the Houthis.
How so?
Well, they might see it as a sign of weakness or a lack of resolve on the part of Israel and the West, and that could lead them to escalate their own actions.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It could pave the way for peace, or it could backfire and make things even worse.
Exactly. It's too early to tell what the ultimate outcome will be, but it's definitely something we need to keep a close eye on.
Absolutely. We'll be sure to keep our listeners updated on any developments. Now, before we move on, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the Houthis and their claims of responsibility for attacks in Sana'a. What's their strategy here? Is this a genuine attempt to shift blame or a sign of internal power struggles within the Houthi movement?
That's a great question. It's hard to say for sure what their motivations are, but it's worth considering a few possibilities. One possibility is that they're trying to create a narrative that portrays them as victims of Western aggression, even within their own territory. This could be a way of gaining sympathy and support from the international community or from segments of the Yemeni population that are opposed to foreign intervention.
So it's a propaganda play, essentially.
Exactly. It's about controlling the narrative and shaping public perception. Another possibility is that these attacks are a manifestation of internal power struggles within the Houthi movement itself. There may be factions within the group that are vying for control, and these attacks could be a way of consolidating power or silencing dissent.
So it could be a combination of internal and external factors at play.
Yeah.
It seems like the Houthis are playing a very calculated game with multiple objectives in mind.
I think that's a fair assessment. They're navigating a very complex landscape, both domestically and internationally, and they're using a variety of tactics to advance their interests.
Well, that's all the time we have for part one of this deep dive. But don't worry, we'll be back soon with part two, where we'll delve even deeper into the complexities of this conflict.
Picking up where we left off, it's important to remember that this conflict isn't just about military actions and geopolitical maneuvering.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We can't lose sight of the human cost of this war.
Exactly. Yemen has been grappling with this humanitarian crisis for years, and this ongoing conflict has just made things so much worse.
It's truly heartbreaking to think about the millions of people who are facing starvation, disease, displacement, all because of this fighting.
It's a stark reminder that behind the headlines and, all of the strategic analysis, there are real people whose lives are being absolutely torn apart by this.
So given all of this complexity, the various actors, the humanitarian crisis, the shifting strategies, what is the path forward? Is there any hope for a resolution?
It's a really daunting question, but I do believe there are steps that can be taken to try and move towards a more stable future.
Okay, I'm all ears. What needs to happen?
Well, first and foremost, there has to be a genuine commitment to a political solution. This means all sides coming to the negotiating table in good faith, willing to compromise and make concessions.
That sounds good in theory, but in reality it seems like a long shot. The Houthis have shown very little willingness to compromise, and the Yemeni government is so weak and fragmented.
I agree, it's an incredibly challenging situation. But that doesn't mean we should give up on diplomacy. It's really the only way to break this cycle of violence and create a lasting peace.
So diplomacy is key. What else needs to be addressed?
We also need to tackle the underlying issues that are fueling this conflict. We can't just focus on stopping the fighting. We have to address the root causes of the instability.
And what are those root causes?
Well, for one, poverty is rampant in Yemen. The lack of opportunity, the lack of access to basic services, it creates fertile ground for unrest and extremism.
That makes sense.
Okay.
If people are struggling to survive, they're more likely to be drawn to groups that promise change, even if those groups resort to violence.
Precisely. And then there's the issue of governance. The Yemeni government has been plagued by corruption and inefficiency, further eroding public trust and creating a vacuum that armed groups like the Houthis can exploit.
So it's a vicious cycle. Poor governance leads to instability, which creates opportunities for armed groups, which then further weakens the government.
Exactly. Breaking this cycle requires a multifaceted approach that includes not just diplomacy and conflict resolution, but also economic development, good governance, social justice.
That sounds like a tall order, especially in a country that's already been ravaged by war.
I don't want to minimize the challenges, but I do believe it's possible. But it can't just be Yemen figuring this out on their own. The role of external actors is absolutely crucial.
Speaking of external actors, you mentioned earlier that the U.S., the U.K., and Israel are all involved in military actions against the Houthis. How can these countries be part of the solution instead of contributing to the problem?
It's a delicate balance. Military intervention might be necessary in some cases to prevent atrocities or protect vital interests.
Like those Red Sea shipping lanes we were talking about.
Exactly. But military action should always be a last resort, and it should be part of a broader strategy that prioritizes diplomatic solutions and addresses the underlying causes of the conflict.
So less focus on military might and more on diplomatic pressure and addressing those root causes we discussed earlier.
Right. External actors need to use their influence to encourage dialogue, compromise, and meaningful reforms. They should be supporting initiatives that promote good governance, economic development, and social inclusion.
It's a tough road ahead, but it sounds like there is a path, albeit a challenging one, towards a more peaceful and stable Yemen.
I agree. It won't be easy, and it will require a sustained commitment from all parties involved, both within Yemen and internationally. But the alternative, continued conflict and suffering, is simply unacceptable.
Well said. Now, I know we've been focusing on the big picture, but I want to zoom in on one specific event that's been weighing on my mind.
Okay, let's hear it.
It's that incident with the U.S. fighter jet being shot down by friendly fire. It's just such a tragic and seemingly avoidable mistake.
Yeah.
What are the implications of this event, both for the U.S. military and for the broader conflict?
That incident is a really stark reminder of the inherent risks of any military operation, even one conducted by a force as technologically advanced and well-trained as the U.S. military.
It's almost unbelievable. A state-of-the-art fighter jet operating in a complex airspace taken down by a missile from its own side.
It really underscores the fact that technology, no matter how sophisticated, is not foolproof. And in the fog of war, where split-second decisions are being made under immense pressure, the potential for human error is always present.
It makes you wonder what went wrong. Don't they have systems in place to prevent friendly fire?
They do, of course. But as with any system, there are limitations. There can be malfunctions, miscommunications, breakdowns in procedures.
In this case, it seems like a combination of factors contributed to the tragedy.
That's right. The report suggests that the USS Gettysburg misidentified the FA-18 as a hostile aircraft. It's still unclear exactly what led to that misidentification, but it's likely a combination of human error, technological limitations, and the inherent complexities of operating in that kind of high-stress combat environment.
It's a sobering reminder that even with the best training and equipment, mistakes can happen, and in a conflict zone, those mistakes can have devastating consequences.
And it's not just about the immediate loss of life or equipment. Incidents like this can have a ripple effect, damaging morale, eroding public trust, and raising questions about the overall competence and strategy of the military operation.
Absolutely. It can fuel anti-war sentiment and make it even harder to justify the intervention to both domestic and international audiences.
In a conflict like Yemen, where public support is already fragile, an incident like this can further undermine the legitimacy of the intervention and make it even more difficult to achieve a peaceful resolution.
It's a tragic reminder of the human cost of war, even when it's unintentional.
Indeed. And as the conflict in Yemen continues to unfold, it's crucial to keep this incident in mind. It serves as a cautionary tale, highlighting the need for constant vigilance, rigorous training, clear communication, and a relentless pursuit of safeguards to minimize the risk of these kinds of tragedies happening again.
Well said. And on that note, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll delve into some intriguing details from those Thai news reports that shed light on the motivations and strategies of the various actors involved in this very complex conflict. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Yemen conflict. And, we've talked about a lot.
Yeah.
The escalating military actions, the humanitarian crisis, the potential for a ceasefire, the complex web of actors involved. But I want to zero in on something that really jumped out at me in those Thai news reports.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
It was a small detail, but it really got me thinking.
Yeah.
The reports mentioned that in those U.S. retaliatory strikes against the Houthis, one of the targets was a facility where they were developing anti-ship missiles.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about the importance of the Red Sea shipping lanes and how the Houthis could, trying to disrupt them.
Right.
But if they're developing more advanced anti-ship missiles, that raises the stakes considerably.
Absolutely. I mean, it suggests that they're not content with just harassing commercial vessels. They're aiming to develop the capability to seriously threaten or even sink large ships.
Right.
Which has huge implications, not just for the conflict itself, but for global trade. The economies that rely on those shipping routes.
It's a big deal.
Exactly. Imagine the impact if they managed to sink a major oil tanker or a container ship carrying essential goods. I mean, it would send shockwaves through the global economy.
Yeah, it would be a major escalation of the conflict, too, potentially drawing in even more international actors.
And let's not forget about the potential environmental consequences, too. An oil spill in the Red Sea would be an ecological disaster.
That's right. So this seemingly small detail about anti-ship missiles actually reveals a lot about the Houthis' ambitions and the potential for this conflict to have really far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, it really highlights the fact that this is not just some isolated local conflict. This has the potential to impact the entire world.
It's a stark reminder that we can't afford to ignore what's happening in Yemen, even if it seems far away.
And it really underscores the urgent need for a diplomatic solution, one that addresses the root causes of this conflict and prevents it from spiraling even further out of control.
Well said. Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. We've covered so much ground today, from the escalating military actions to the humanitarian crisis to the potential for a ceasefire.
Yeah, we've explored this complex web of actors, the motivations and strategies at play, and as you said, the potential for this conflict to have really far-reaching consequences.
It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking conversation for sure, but it's also left me feeling a bit overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of it all.
I understand. It's a lot to take in. But I think the important thing is that we're all now more informed about the challenges facing Yemen and the region as a whole.
Yeah, and hopefully that awareness will lead to more informed discussions and a greater sense of urgency in finding a peaceful resolution.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay, what's that?
We've seen how the Houthis are developing increasingly sophisticated weaponry, how external actors are getting drawn into this conflict, and really how the whole situation has the potential to escalate dramatically. So the question now is, what role will the international community play in shaping the future of Yemen? Will they prioritize military solutions, or will they really push for diplomacy and address those underlying issues that are fueling this conflict? The answer to that question will have a profound impact, not only on the people of Yemen, but on the stability of the entire region and potentially the world.
Really a question we all need to be asking ourselves right now. The future of Yemen hangs in the balance, and the choices that we make today will determine whether it descends further into chaos or finds a path toward peace and stability.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. And as always, we encourage you to stay engaged with this issue, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to use your voice to advocate for a peaceful and just resolution to the conflict in Yemen.